All right, welcome back. Happy Friday or weekend, everybody. Getting close. We are moving through our pollution unit here. We've got really just a couple more weeks to think about it. So, we're moving right along. We're going to get done as much as we can between now and then. All right. We're going to talk today about a specific way that chemical pollution can affect the food web. And most notably, the ways in which this can affect humans. In some cases, in very serious ways. Okay? I mean, a lot of what we've talked about with pollution so far has been it's bad for the environment, it's bad for this species, it's bad for that species, and that's all fine and that's bad. Obviously, we should try to avoid harming other species, but when we start hearing about ways that this can have huge effects on real human beings, well, suddenly it may become a little more serious in the minds of a lot of people. Okay. So what we're talking about here is called biomagnification, which is a big word. All it means, though, is the increasing concentration of a substance in organisms higher up in a food chain. Okay. And here we're talking about some kind of chemical pollutant. Things we hear about today would be like mercury. Okay. Mercury is well, it's a metal in its pure form, but in various kinds of chemical compounds, it can be dissolved in water, and it can be highly dangerous. It's toxic. It causes permanent brain damage, actually, especially in young people as their brains are developing. Okay, and that's something that can bioaccumulate. It can reach higher and higher concentrations in organisms that are higher up the food chain. Okay, so you can see here we've got a very basic food chain, starting with these mayflies, which are insects, then bluegills, a small fish, bass, a large fish, and then in this case, it shows the human that maybe has eaten the bass. And each step along the way, the level of that pollutant in that organism, in its muscle tissue or just in its body, gets higher and higher. Okay. So generally, biomagnification refers to toxins. I mean, I guess technically we could use that term to refer to things that are not toxic, but we're talking about things, like I said, mercury, arsenic, pesticides, anything like that. Okay. These can biomagnify. All right. Now, the way it works is there's very low levels of this particular toxin in the environment. Usually it's barely measurable, like dissolved in the water. Okay. Tiny, tiny amounts, but it's absorbed by the producers, the first step on the food chain, just because they live in the water. So plants, bacteria, protists, things like that, they live in the water. So a small amount, very small amount of this toxin just accumulates in their bodies. Not enough to harm them or anything. Again, still barely enough to measure. But over time, the longer they live there, the concentration increases. More and more and more builds up. Still not enough to really harm them. But these organisms at the bottom of the food chain, the producers that are very slightly contaminated, are eaten by the first step of consumers, okay, by animals. The toxin then builds up in this primary consumer, in the small organism, the fish or the insect or something. It builds up in their bodies. And the more of these producers they eat, the more plants or bacteria or things they eat, the more toxin builds up in them. Well, then something comes along and eats this primary consumer. We get higher on the food chain. Bigger fish comes along. But because this first fish had some toxins in it, well, those toxins build up in the bigger fish, and it eats more and more little minnows. It builds up more and more and more toxins. And this just keeps going and going. Each step of the way up the food chain, the concentrations get higher and higher. Until at the highest levels of the food chain, with something like a bald eagle, there can be very dangerous concentrations of these pollutants, of these toxins. Okay? So let's talk about mercury in fish, because that's the one that these days we hear about the most. There have been other chemicals in the past that cause these problems as well. We hear the most about mercury. Okay? So we take a real simple, greatly simplified food chain. At the bottom of the food chain, we have plankton, like right here. Okay, very small plants, animals, algae, things like that, tiny things. Okay. Then they are eaten by small fish, like let's say, little minnows, and then the medium fish eat the smaller fish, and the largest fish eat the medium fish. Okay, pretty basic food chain. Now, there's very, very low levels of mercury in all ocean water. The exact level, changes with exactly where you are, how close you are to the nearest coal power plant, which is where the mercury comes from, and ocean currents and stuff. But generally, it's measured in parts per trillion. Okay, so if we have, a trillion water molecules, then we'd have like a few mercury atoms. Okay, that's the concentration we're talking about, parts per trillion. So very low concentration. In the plankton, we generally get a concentration of around 1 part per billion. Okay, and remember, there's 1,000 billion in 1 trillion. So depending on what exactly the concentration in ocean water was, we're talking the concentration in the plankton then is 10 to 100 times higher than it was in the water. Okay. Now, those plankton get eaten and it moves up the food chain. If we look at a relatively small fish, not even a minnow, but a relatively small fish, a shad, okay, they're about 5 pounds. They live in the ocean. The average concentration in shad, I looked this up, I found it. The average concentration in shad that are caught in, I believe it was in the Gulf of Mexico, or off Florida or something, 0.039 parts per million. That's 0.039 mercury parts per million fish parts. Okay, that's the unit that we use. Okay, and the small fish, 40 times higher than the plankton. If we go up to a larger fish, yellowfin tuna, okay, about 100 pounds they can get to. Now we're at 0.35 parts per million, which is 10 times higher than it was in the shad. And if we go to an even bigger fish, like a swordfish, they can be 800 pounds or more. Then we're to basically 1 part per million, 3 times higher than we were in the yellowfin tuna. The bigger the fish, the higher it is up the food chain. In all likelihood, it has higher mercury levels. Okay, and actually, for this reason, there are specific recommendations made for how much of which type of fish is considered safe for certain vulnerable populations to have. This mercury is dangerous for anybody, but it's most dangerous for a growing nervous system, a developing brain. Okay, it's a lot like lead in that sense. Just like lead paint was most dangerous for young children, mercury is most dangerous for very young children because their brains and nervous systems still have the most growing to do. And it's also considered dangerous then for women who are pregnant or women who may at some point become pregnant. Because even if they're not pregnant now, the mercury can build up in their bodies, and then years later when they're pregnant can cause problems for the baby. This has happened before, okay? And we're talking permanent brain damage, birth defects, things like that, okay? Even in low levels, it can cause learning difficulties, all sorts of problems for the kid. So women who are pregnant are told not to eat swordfish. It's a fish that's specifically listed. Do not eat swordfish if you're pregnant. Others, you're not supposed to eat shark if you're pregnant. Any kind of shark, because they're a large fish that's high up the food chain and they can have a lot of mercury in them. There's a couple others that are specifically said, don't ever eat these. And then other fish, it's said, don't eat very much. Eat it only maybe once a month, okay? Or maybe only once a week. Whereas fish that are lower on the food chain, well, maybe it's completely unrestricted. Eat as much as you want. I'll show you some of this in a little bit, actually. Specific recommendations in Indiana. Okay, now, other possible consequences, though. Now, this, as we said, it can be dangerous for humans. It can also be dangerous for the top predator animals. Okay, a different chemical that biomagnifies, a pesticide called DDT. And DDT was the pesticide that was most covered in that book Silent Spring that you read the intro to. Okay, DDT biomagnifies. Okay, DDT was widely used because it is, or it seems to be, non-toxic for humans. Okay, and it didn't seem to poison or kill any animals. Okay. So it was great. It killed the mosquitoes, it killed the insects and everything, but it didn't kill other animals. So it was widely used. But it turns out that DDT in the body of a female bird causes the eggs that that bird lays, the shells, to be very thin and weak. So she lays the eggs, and then when the bird sits on the eggs, they'd be crushed. Okay. So it didn't like directly poison the mother or anything, but it just made the eggs become basically, where they could never hatch because they'd be crushed beforehand. So large predatory birds, especially birds that hunt fish, bald eagles, osprey, and peregrine falcons. Peregrines don't hunt fish, but they're large predatory birds. They very nearly went extinct in the United States in the 1960s and 70s in this time of widespread DDT use. Okay. DDT was banned in 1972, except in rare circumstances. Finally, we're now almost 50 years later, finally the populations are recovering. Okay, where you could see eagles, you can see osprey, which are a lot of fun to watch. You could see peregrines in places, finally, again. But it has taken that long for these populations to recover. I mean, can you imagine if in the United States, bald eagles, the symbol of this country, if they went extinct? So when this was realized what DDT was doing, this led to this outcry, and it was ultimately banned. Okay. Now, I just want to show you real quick here. You can, if you do any amount of fishing, or if you eat fish that others have caught, okay, Indiana actually has a website. This is on the Indiana government website, where you can look at a map, and it tells you about all kinds of fish. Okay, there's information here about how, health benefits and contaminants and everything. But if you open this map, it gets to right here. Now, I've zoomed in a little bit to get us closer to places we may be familiar with. All right, so like here's St. Joe County right here. Here's be Walkerton right in there. All right, and you can click on any body of water. There's a few that they may not have, but like right here, if I click on that, that's Coons Lake. Okay, and it says the sensitive population. So the sensitive population, this is a little small, you may not be able to see, includes females under the age of 50 and males under the age of 15. So any children and any woman who might at some point become pregnant, and also people with compromised immune systems. So for this sensitive population, these are the fish that they had tested, the mercury levels in Coons Lake. Bluegill, unrestricted consumption. You can eat as much as you want. Crappie, unrestricted consumption. You can eat as much as you want. Those are small panfish. But in largemouth bass, the sensitive population should not eat more than one meal per week. Okay? But the general population, so that's women who have no chance of ever becoming pregnant, and any men, adult men, okay, unrestricted consumption in all these. So there must be some very low levels of mercury in the largemouth bass, not enough to be dangerous for men, for adults, basically, but could potentially be dangerous for children or babies. So they should limit how much of this fish they eat. Okay. And again, you can go around, you can click on any of these, like, or the river here. Okay. Here's the Kankakee River. Okay. For the sensitive population, lots of stuff is one meal per week. They tested many species of fish. Look at this: crappie, largemouth, northern, catfish. Okay, a lot of one meal per week. Okay, but general population, it's largely unrestricted. Okay, so this is a useful site to check out. Again, if you do any amount of fishing and eating. Okay. You can just click around here. It does show you all these different like public access sites and everything, which is helpful if you're looking for a new place to go fishing. All right. Hope this helps. Have a good one. Enjoy your weekend.